YouTubes. Okay, so we're pretty much going to pick up where we left off on Tuesday. So we're going to continue walking through some different HTML elements and just the types of things that we can do with HTML. So next up is forms. So forms are what we'll use for any type of user input. So anytime the user needs to provide some information to the website, any user interaction is typically done via forms. So things like a search box, a contact form, order form, login and register, those types of things. We have several types of form controls that will allow different types of input. So we've got text, and even amongst those, there are different types. Password is a specific, form control that has different settings on it. We've got some choices, so like radio buttons, checkboxes, and then the form submits the information to the web server, which then processes it. So really, we're just displaying a form, and we've got a bunch of settings and configurations on it. We can handle form submissions in JavaScript, so we'll talk about that when we get there. But by default, the browser, when you click submit, sends the form data to whatever URL you've configured. So we don't really deal with, processing the form in the HTML. That's all handled either via JavaScript or on the server side. So the form element wraps the entire form. There's a required attribute of action, which provides the URL that the form submits its information to. So whatever URL you put in the action attribute is where the data will be sent. Then we also have a method that goes along with that, and it can be either get or post. So we recognize those as HTTP methods. So you can make form submissions that are just GET requests, so something like a search, where you're not necessarily, submitting data to be processed. You're just making a request for some specific information. So we would use a GET for that. Yeah, question?
So say you're using a GET request and you want the information to appear on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
Would your action be the same URL? Would you have to provide the URL?
Yeah, it could be the same URL. Typically, we would handle that with JavaScript too. If you wanted to make a request and then display the results without refreshing the page, that would be done via JavaScript. But yeah, you could have the GET be the same URL that you're on, and you're adding some data that's going to be identify what resource you're wanting to get. Like a search would do that, right? Like you're going to send the search term, the server will return the results page. And the server can redirect you and stuff like that as well as a result of your form submission. It's a good question. So GET is for retrieving. It's also the default, so you don't have to provide a method attribute in your form, and if you don't, GET will be what is used. Post will use to submit any sort of data. So if it's like a contact form, login, even any type of thing like that will be a post request that's sending data. We use inputs for several different types of form control. So input is a kind of a generic input element, and we can use attributes to specify what type of input it is. It's an empty element, so it just has the slash at the end. There's no text that goes inside of it. There's a type attribute, which determines the type of input that it is. So that's how we distinguish between text inputs and radio boxes or checkboxes, etc. We then have a name attribute that's very important, which gives a unique name to the input that identifies it when sent to the web server. So when you send data to the server needs to know what the name of the fields you're sending are, right? If you just send, a bunch of, if you have a first name and a last name field, and you just send the first name and the last name without any sort of identifier of which is the first name, which is the last name, what are these fields, then the server doesn't know how to process it. So the name attribute is how we add an identifier to our form inputs that get sent with the data. So it'll be like key value. It'll have the name of the input, and then it'll have the value of the input next to it. So the server has that correlation. So like for name, you might have it be first name or last name or something along those lines. Okay. So some different text inputs. So we have input type of text, which will create just a one-line text box. We also have password, which creates a specific password box, which is when you type it in, you just see like stars or little bullet points or something. So it obfuscates the input. So if someone's watching over your shoulder, they don't see your password. Text area is a little bit different. It's not used an input. It's a different type of element that we use for a multi-line text box. So something that's like an email or something that's, a message, something like that may have multiple lines or paragraphs even. We use text box or text area for that. Content that you put inside the text area element. So text area is not a self-closing element. It can have content in it. And whatever content you put inside the element will be pre-filled into the text box. So that's a way you can put in some sort of default or instructions or something like that. So for example, you can say text area and then like your comments here and then close the text area and then your comments here will already be typed into the text box when the user sees it. We use radio to create a radio button. So input type of radio. That's typically for like multiple choice or single choice actually, like when there's multiple options and they can only select one. It's like the little round radio button. We use the name attribute to group multiple radio buttons together. So you can have multiple radio buttons with the same name attribute, and just whichever one is selected is the one that will be sent. So that's how you can kind of group multiple options together. The value attribute, which we add to the radio input, indicates the value of that input. So we might have, several radio buttons with the same value, but different, with the same name but different values, indicating which one is selected. There's also a checked attribute which we can use to sort of set a default option, so that one will be selected by default. Show an example of this here in a second. Here's an example. So say we've got a form and we want the user to select their favorite type of music. We've got 3 radio buttons here. They all have the same name, which is genre, but they each have different values. So there's rock, pop, and jazz. So whichever one of these is selected, the the server will get name, genre, value, pop, if that's what's been selected. The rest won't be sent to the server, so only the one that's selected gets included with your data. And here's how we use checked. Technically, you don't have to have a value here. It's just kind of a flag saying this input should be checked by default. So you're saying this is the default option. But it's typically a best practice to put checked equals checked. Some people do checked equals yes or just checked equals blank. It doesn't actually matter what the value is. This doesn't change anything. It's just kind of a pattern. That's just kind of a best practice to do checked equals checked. Any questions about form so far? All right. Okay. In contrast to radio buttons, we can also do checkboxes. So input type checkbox creates a checkbox where you can have multiple options selected. Similarly, we use the name attribute to group checkboxes together. So unlike radio boxes, multiple checkboxes with the same name attribute can be selected. And whichever ones are selected will get sent to the server. Same way you use value to indicate the value sent if that checkbox is checked. And we also can use the checked attribute here to have it be pre-selected. So here's an example of using checkboxes. So here's maybe, choose the music services that you use. So the name of these checkboxes is all the same, music service. That's our identifier. The value is different, so iTunes, Spotify, or Google Play. One of these, so this one is checked by default because it's got checked by checked. So that'll just be selected when the user loads the page. And then if we check all 3, when we hit submit, the server will get the data and it'll say that name music service value iTunes, name music service value Spotify, name music service value Google Play. And the servers kind of will handle that a little bit differently. Some of them combine it into an array of values with that name. Some of them just have distinct, entries in the data object. Just kind of depends on how, the server is configured to handle that type of input. Drop-down list. So we can use select, which is a new type of element, to create a drop-down. And then we have options inside of the select, which will provide the options that you can choose from. Instead of checked, we use selected equals selected, which will pre-select an option on page load. We can also do multiple equals multiple, which will allow multiple selections. So, there are some drop-downs where you can only choose one. There are some drop-downs. It turns more into a list, but you can hold command and select several of them. Typically, I don't like to use multiple on selects. I'd rather use a radio button or checkboxes if there's going to be something the user can select multiple of than a list, but there are places that you would use it. So here's an example of a list. So we have our select element. Same as the rest, it has a name, which is devices. So that's the identifier of what the data is that we're sending. Here we've said multiple equals multiple, so you can select, all three of these values if you'd like. We've got three different option values, so iPod, radio, or mobile. So this is what device you use to listen to music. iPod is selected equals selected, so that value is going to be selected by default. Inside of the option tag, we put the label that the user actually sees. So it's pretty important. Whatever is inside that option tag is what the user will see in the dropdown. So one thing to notice is that can be different than the value of your selected option. So you might use something in your value. For instance, here value is just all lowercase because typically when you're sending data with servers, you want it to be machine readable, we'll call it. So typically all lowercase. Typically don't use spaces, use dashes instead, stuff like that. It makes it a little bit easier to deal with on the server side. So we can have our value be something that's a little bit more computer friendly, whereas our label here can be, capitalized, it can have spaces, dashes, whatever we want. It's just a text, label that the user sees. You'll see this if you select your country or something like that. The country names will be fully capitalized and spaced or whatever, but behind the scenes, the values of those inputs are probably a short country code or something that uniquely identifies that country, just because it's a little bit easier to handle, on the server side when you're dealing with. You're not having to parse a full text option. You're dealing with a more, computer readable code. Okay, another option we have is type of file, which allows the users to upload a file. So we can do this for uploads, add a photo or something like that. The behavior is a little bit different in each browser. Typically, you'll see a little window and a browse button. And if you click on that browse button, it will pull up a file selection dialog from your browser, and you can choose the file. Sometimes they'll let you drag a file into the input. So it's a little bit different from browser to browser. One thing to keep in mind is that your server really needs to be configured to allow for file uploads, to provide this option. You can't just start, adding file inputs to your forms because the server has to be able to accept that input and then do something with it. But this is how we would send a file along with our data. So in the submit button, so we use input type equals submit to submit our form. The name attribute is optional. The value attribute here actually provides the text that is displayed on the submit button. And I'm actually not a big fan of the way that works because typically on most of our other form inputs, value is kind of the behind the scenes value that gets sent to the server, right? And in this case, the value is actually the label. So I find that to be a little inconsistent. If I was on a committee at the W3C, I would propose that we change that, but that's how it works. So again, we have our input type of submit, and then value is send message, and that's what the user will see on the button. There are other ways to submit a form. If you're using JavaScript, you can attach form submission to any button. You could create a link. You could, do various types of things and attach the form submission to that. But if we're just dealing with HTML, you have to use the input type of submit and put it inside your form element. And that's how the user submits the form. Yeah, question?
Is the value attribute how you differentiate on the server side, which, like if you had multiple submits, which one's coming in?
Yeah, it's actually the name attribute that you would use. So that's a good question. You can have multiple submit buttons. So say you have like a save or like a edit or a delete or something like that. You can use the name attribute, and the server gets the name of your whatever button you pressed. So yeah, you could use that to differentiate between different buttons. Great question. The value may get sent to the server, but again, it's not typically used for data purposes. It's just a label. So good question. Any other questions? Another option is you can use input type equals image, which you can use a custom image for the submit button. So if you want the submit button to match your theme or be 3D or something like that, you can use input type equals image. It uses the same attributes as the image tag, so you use source, and you also need to make sure to use alt along with your image type equals image. Because again, screen readers can't read that image, so if your image has text in it and says like, send message or something like that, the screen reader will say, okay, there's an image there, I don't know what it says, so you need to provide some alt text so that screen readers know what that image is for. So they'll know to click it if they're submitting the form. Another option is hidden inputs. So we won't really use this in class, although we might some when we get into React. But image type or input type equals hidden will create form controls that are not shown on the page. So they're not displayed visually at all. So we'll use this for kind of things that are behind the scenes, things that the user doesn't need to input or edit, but that the server may need along with the form input. So things like a timestamp or some sort of calculated field. Say you have like an order form and the user selected a bunch of products, you may calculate a running total and put that as a hidden field so that there's a subtotal field that goes along, and you've calculated it in JavaScript or something, and you just put it in the value of that field via JavaScript. Things like user ID. I use this, at work with different forms that we have on our webpage. We'll put the user ID as a hidden field so that on the server, when we get this request, we know what user that form submission correlates to. One thing to note, though, is that you can see hidden inputs if you view source, so don't use it for anything sensitive. I've seen that used poorly. Sometimes they'll use a hidden form field and they'll put even something like subtotal, right? So if you put like a subtotal as a hidden form field, a really smart user might, go to your inspector, look at the form, see that hidden input, see the subtotal there is, $50, and in the inspector you can edit the value of that form field and say $10 and submit, or free and submit, and now that the value of that hidden input is different than what you've calculated it to be. So if you trust it on the server side, you might run into problems. So typically, just as a general rule, as far as like security goes, never trust user input. Never trust user input for important things, especially things like subtotal. So if you use a hidden field, to calculate the subtotal, that's fine for certain things, but don't use it as your sole source of truth. Don't say, okay, I will charge the user that much because the form said that's what the subtotal was. You want to calculate it on your own in the server side and verify it. So again, don't trust user input. That's the number one or a top rule of web security, is to not trust user input, because through inspector or through other methods, the user can change your form. They can change the names and values of your inputs because it's all in the browser. You have no control over it once it's in the browser. So, okay, another thing that we can do is add labels to our form elements. So we use the label element for this to label different form controls. We can associate the labels with the inputs in two different ways, and it's really important to do this because, again, for screen readers, if they're reading the screen and they see a checkbox, they need to know what label goes with that checkbox, or they see an input, they need to know what the label is that goes with that input. And so these two methods are ways that screen readers are aware of. So when they see an input, they know how to look up and find the label element that goes along with it. So they can say, okay, here's a text input, the label is first name. So the ways that they know to associate it, we can place the input inside the label element. So the label element will wrap both the label and the input. So we say a label, we can have first name, and then we have our input, and then we close our label. That's one way of doing it, perfectly valid. Another way that I kind of prefer a little bit, because it gives you a little more flexibility, is to use a for attribute on the label, and then an ID attribute on your form control. So we've got our label here, label for equals first name, and then we have the actual label. And then we've got our input, and here we've got an ID attribute of first name. So this has to match. The for and the ID here have to match exactly. And then the screen reader comes along and says, okay, here's an input, the ID is first name. Is there a label that has that for value on it? And if so, it will read the input. It's also important, even just visually, browsers will do certain things. If you're like tabbing through a form, sometimes it'll highlight the label for you, something like that. So there's other valid reasons other than just screen readers to make sure that your labels and your form inputs are pretty well connected. Again, I like the second way a little bit better because it provides you a little bit more flexibility. If you do it like this, you have some issues with moving your input around too much. Like if you want your labels on one side and your inputs on the other side, or you want them above each other, or you want to move them around in certain ways. Here, you're kind of restricted a little bit because if you move your label, your form input's going to move with it, right? If you say, okay, label, position relative, top 20 pixels or something, they're all going to move because the input's inside it. But this way, you can kind of move them each independently, so it's a little bit more flexible. But they're still connected, programmatically. Your label location is also important, so you want to make sure it's obvious which input corresponds with that label. So there's multiple ways you can do it. Typically, you want it either above or to the left. But even if you do it above, one thing I like to do is space things out a little bit, just to make it clear. So like if you have a form and you've got a label and then an input and then a label and an input, like this, and especially if it's kind of a long form, at some point, when you scroll down, it can start to get a little bit confusing. Users might think, this label goes here or something. So if you do it that way, at least kind of space things out so that it's really clear which label goes with which input, something along those lines. Also valid to, do it like this, obviously. The main key is to not get too fancy with it, because if you try and get too fancy, chances are users are going to get confused. And you guys probably have run into this, if you've got a form that's like, got some inputs here, and then the labels are like off to the side or somewhere where it just doesn't really make as much sense and it's kind of harder to correlate, you're a lot more likely to make a mistake. So just think about what the user's going to see, think about what makes the most sense, follow patterns. We'll talk about this a little more when we talk about design principles as well. Okay, so there's a couple ways to group form elements together. So we can use the field set element to group a set of form controls together. So it's useful for like longer forms. So say, it's like a, college application. You might have personal info. You might have, school history. You might have grades. You might have volunteer experience as sort of separate sections that each would have multiple fields to be filled out. So we use field set for that. We use legend to give a caption to our field set. So that's our kind of our label for each field set. So here's an example of how it works. So we've got our opening field set. We've got a legend called contact me, and then we can have our inputs. So they each still need a label. Then obviously later on we would close the field set and we could open a new field set or something like that. And these field sets go inside our form element as well. So the form should wrap the whole thing. There's a few handy form features that HTML5 has added that are really good to be aware of. So again, these are features added by the browser. Most of them at this point are supported in some way, or at least they won't break anything if they're not supported. So, for instance, you can identify a field as required with the required attribute. So that's kind of a nice feature. If there's a field that absolutely needs to get filled out, you can set it to be required. Yeah, question?
Is that, like, you still have to deal with that on the server side? Because couldn't someone just go in and remove it?
Yeah, you totally do. That's a really good point. So it's convenient because the browser will highlight it, if you don't fill it out, and the browser won't let you submit the form unless it's filled out. But you're right. The user can absolutely remove that required element or that required attribute. So yeah, you still have to validate it on the server side, absolutely. And none of these features really replace server-side validation. So if you're going into web development and you're taking other classes that deal with the server side of things, you absolutely need to validate all user input. Again, don't trust user input ever. Validate it, make sure it's correct, make sure it's complete, and return an error from the server if it's not, and be able to handle that error in your front end. But these are still useful features that for 99% of users, help solve the problem of users forgetting to fill out a field or something like that. So again, required, different browsers handle it differently. Some of them will highlight it red, some of them will underline it. It's a little bit up to the browser how they force that to be filled out. You can also use input type equals date, which will add a date picker. So it'll kind of put a little icon in the corner, and the user can click it and then choose the date on a little calendar. Older browsers will still just show this as a text box. So again, if the browser doesn't support the date input, that's no problem. The user can just type it in as a text box. We can also use input type of email, which will verify proper email address format. Again, older browsers will just show it as text, but if it's a modern browser, if they don't put in a proper email format, it'll reject it and cause them, highlight red or something like that. Again, we still need to validate it on the server side before we save it in our database or before we start sending emails to it, because we still can't trust it, but it's a nice feature that kind of helps prevent those problems. We also have an input type of URL. It's really nice. I like using these inputs a lot too, because another feature of them is that on your mobile device, a lot of phones will actually adjust the keyboard a little bit based on what that input is, or autofill. So if your phone sees an input type of email, if your phone knows your email address, a lot of times you'll see an autofill option. Also, it'll add the @ symbol and a .com and .net shortcut on your keyboard, stuff like that. So I really like using these inputs primarily just for mobile, so they get a little bit more tailored, experience. There's the same with number. I can't remember if it's input type equals number. I think it may be. I didn't mention it here, but it does a similar thing, and it'll pull up a number keypad instead of a full keyboard on your mobile device, and that's really handy too, especially for something that's going to be a longer number or. So really, really useful. I get annoyed now when I'm filling out a form on my phone and I click an input that I know is a number and the full keyboard pulls up and you have to click the little number thing and then type the little tiny numbers. So really nice to use the inputs specified. Input type search is a little bit different. It's not that useful, I don't think. The main feature that they add is they add a clear button on the far right of the input, so a little X that you can click to clear the input. So it can be kind of nice if it's an interactive, where you've got a search box that the user will type in and it may actively filter something that they're seeing that you're doing with JavaScript. So I would only really worry about this when you're, doing JavaScript. Otherwise, it's just a text box. Usually they're rounded for some reason, because search boxes should be rounded, apparently. So I don't find this super useful. One thing you can do now as well with HTML5 is there's a placeholder attribute that you can use on text inputs, which will add background text in the text field. So you remember we said in text area you can put some text in between your opening and closing tags, and it'll be auto-filled with that. The annoying thing is the user has to delete that text if they don't want it there, and it's only text area that supports it. But with placeholder, you can actually add some text that is shown in the background of the input until the user starts typing something, and then it disappears. So you've probably seen this. So it'll just I'll show you an example here in a bit, but it'll, you use it for labels most of the time. So you may say, first name, And usually it's kind of grayed out a little bit and it kind of blends in with the background. And then once the user clicks on that input, it disappears and they can start typing. So they don't have to like select it and delete it. It just kind of shows up in the background. Yeah, question?
So I've seen two different types of placeholders. One where you click on it and then it'll automatically highlight the text, and as you start typing, it'll delete it. And
Mm-hmm.
there's other ones where you click on it, the text will immediately disappear. But
Yeah.
if you click out of the form, that text will reappear.
Oh, if you haven't typed anything, probably, yeah. Yeah, so that second one you talked about is the placeholder attribute. There's other ways with JavaScript to like insert, text and then it'll delete it or something like that on input. And some browsers may deal with placeholder a little bit differently, but Chrome and Firefox both have it, where as soon as you click into it, it disappears. And then, yeah, if you don't type anything and you click out of that form input, it'll reappear. Another good use for placeholder is like showing what format you expect certain inputs to be in. So if it's like a credit card input, you could have it show XXX-XXX or XXX space XXX, something like that. Or phone numbers are the same way if you want to really specify what exact format, whether or not there should be parentheses or dashes, that kind of thing. Okay, I think that's it for forms. Let me show you some examples. Let's see, and actually, I'm going to pull that up. How do I? Okay, sweet. Okay, let's see. Do HTML forms 2. Logged in ahead of time, so I don't have to deal with the CAPTCHAs. Okay, so here's kind of what our form HTML looks like. So again, here's an example using field set. So we've got, this is like an order checkout or something like that. So we've got multiple field sets that kind of separate each section of the form. Each one has multiple inputs. Again, so we see our form input up here, our form element up here. The field sets are all inside of the form. So, the form wraps everything in the form, including the submit button. Here we've got an action. In our case, it's just checkout.php. So that's going to go whatever domain we're on. If we're on, craigswebsite.com, that submit is going to go to craigswebsite.com/checkout.php. So again, typically, whatever URL you put there is going to be some sort of server-side, URL that's going to accept your input. We also have a method. In our case, we're doing post because we're sending a lot of data that the server is going to need to process, and it's going to need to start the fulfillment process. So it's a post. It's not just a get. So again, we've got our field set. We've got our legends that goes right inside our field set, which provides this nice label. And again, you can restyle the way field set works. By default, they kind of put it here, and they draw a line around your whole field set. It's not terrible, but you might change it up a little bit. And you can restyle things however you want once we get into CSS. So here we've got a select. So this shows what a multiple select looks like. So again, I don't like using selects this way because they're kind of confusing and some users don't know how to use them. You have to hold command, to click multiple things or something like that. So typically I would probably rather use checkboxes for a situation like this where there's, multiple products and you're expecting users to select multiple ones. If we did, we'll show you real quick, if we were to take out multiple on our select, then it just becomes a traditional drop-down where the user can just select one. So that's kind of where, that multiple comes into play. So let's change this to checkboxes. So we don't need the select anymore, and we're basically just going to change each option to a checkbox. It's not a checkbox, it's and automatically changed it for us here. We also need a name. We'll just call this product, and then value shoes. Do the same here. One more. Back here. So again, we've used the same name for all of these because that's kind of the class of input we have, you could say. So it gets sent to the server. So, if we didn't have the name, if we just said value equals shirt, server doesn't actually know what to do with that. So we say name is product, value equals shirt. So the server will get an array of all the values that are actually checked. So again, now we have checkboxes. We can select multiple ones. This makes a little bit more sense, I think, than the multi-select in this case. And you notice, I've just got the, we actually don't need the slash input there. That's just it actually works that way if you do slash input, but it's not technically valid. But you notice with these checkboxes, you still have to provide a label. And we could actually do this, with a real label. In fact, let's do that for the first one just for fun. Because the checkbox itself doesn't have any text that goes along with it. Let me close this. So let's add an ID here. And we'll call this, product shoes. And now let's add the label. Well, checkboxes usually the label comes after. So now let's do label for equals product shoes. And we'll copy this. It could just be text like this, but then the screen reader doesn't really know what that text is. So if we move it here to an actual label element, again, it shows up the same way. It's not, displayed in any different way. But now when the screen reader's, reading through the thing and it gets to this checkbox, it'll say, okay, checkbox, it's for shoes. So that way it knows how those are related. Let's look at a couple of these other ones. So here we have the text area. So again, we've got a name, like special requests or something like that. We've got some text here inside of our text area element, which just gets, added here to the form. So again, you have to delete it, which is kind of annoying. So instead of this, we could use placeholder. I'll show you what that looks like. If we just say placeholder equals special requests. Now you see that it's kind of grayed out. It kind of blends in with the background, and once we click into it, it still shows up until we start typing. So once the user starts typing, it disappears, but it's a nice way of just kind of giving some example input or giving another label to show the user what that's supposed to be. So again, then we close our field set and we open a new field set. It's got a new legend. Here we use the label in this other method where we can just have the label wrap the input. That's a perfectly valid way of doing it. One thing to keep in mind, though, is like if you have some text then after the input too, the screen reader will actually read any text inside the label as correlated with that input. So that's something to keep in mind. If you said like, email here, and then here you said, please no Gmail or whatever, the screen reader will actually read email, please no Gmail, and then input. So it'll kind of combine any text inside that label. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Visually, you'll see, the text and then the input and then any text after the input. But as far as the screen reader goes, it doesn't really care that there's an input in the middle there. It'll kind of squish it all together. So just something to keep in mind if you're doing it this way. So here we use the type email, so we'll see what that looks like in Firefox. If we just say, Kraig, Firefox highlights it red. Doesn't actually tell us what we need to do, but like if we tried to submit, it'll pop up and say, please enter an email address. So that's something the browser is doing for us as a feature because that's an email input type. Let me open Chrome and see what it looks like there, because I think it's a little bit different. Eventually. Well, we'll come back to that. Let's see, here's our password input. So again, really nice. As you type, it just shows up. It obfuscates it, so someone looking over your shoulder can't see it. There's nothing more inherently secure about the password input. So something to keep in mind. Just using a password input doesn't automatically make it secure. It just obfuscates the input. So keep that in mind. You still need to consider lots of different security aspects if you're dealing with passwords. It doesn't hash it or anything either. It just sends it plain text to the server. So which is fine in some cases. If you're using HTTPS, you can be reasonably aware that's secure, but you're still going to want to process it on the server side. Here we've got a name, which we've just made required equals required. So that's why that's red, because we didn't fill it out. Here we've just got a checkbox with a label. Here we've got some radio buttons. So we've got input type of radio. So these are two options of how often you want to receive the newsletter. So again, there's nothing that wraps the radio inputs together. The thing that connects them is their name. So we've just got input type of radio, name is frequency, and then value here is weekly. The value here is monthly. This one is checked by default, so you'll see that it's pre-selected. So that's nice if there's a default option you want to handle. Yeah, question.
So when you use the password input option, does it automatically encrypt the password?
No, it doesn't automatically encrypt the password. So if you're using HTTPS, it will. It'll automatically encrypt your entire request. So if you're using HTTPS, it's reasonably safe to send the password unencrypted, just in plain text, because you're kind of trusting HTTPS to deal with that encryption for you. So typically the pattern is to just send the password and then make sure you deal with it on the server. Hash it and save it or whatever you want to do at that point. Yeah, if you're not using HTTPS, you could do your own encryption method. The thing to keep in mind, though, is if you encrypt it in the browser, anybody can see your JavaScript, right? Like, your JavaScript is not secret. So someone could see your encryption method, in any information that JavaScript uses to encrypt, like a key or something like that, is visible in your JavaScript as well. So you have to be kind of careful about doing password encryption in the browser, because anyone can see that or even change it. But that's a good question. So here's the radio buttons. Only one of them can be selected with the same name. So for instance, if we select monthly, weekly gets unchecked. But say we added a new input for some reason. The first one's a checkbox. Yep. But if we added a new one and we gave it a different name, say it was I don't know, something. Doesn't really matter. You know, now we've got this third radio button here, and we can select that one, even though, you know, these two it deselects, because this one has a different value, it can be selected. So only ones that have the same value does it require you to just have one. Here's another drop down. Here's an example of where you would use placeholder as well. You know, so if you're identifying the format of the credit card, you want spaces, not dashes, that kind of thing. I really appreciate when people do that, because there's nothing where you guys have probably, you know, bought something online, you type in your credit card and hit submit, and it's like, oh, that was wrong, don't use dashes or whatever. So it's really nice when you tell your users what, you know, format you're expecting your data in. Here's what the date input looks like. So once we click on it, Firefox opens up a calendar like this, and then you can select whatever you want. I like this a lot because it saves you from having to worry about, you know, the format of your date, whether you use dashes or slashes, whether you have leading zeros, whether you do like 01 / you know, 08. When you have the, you know, drop down, the user can just pick the date. It automatically fills it out for them. You don't have to worry about making mistakes. You don't have to worry about the order, right? Like if you're, you know, from another country that puts the order opposite, you don't have to worry about that here. It handles it for you. You know that the format's going to be good. Again, the user can change this, so don't just trust it. You know, the user could, you know, edit this and change it to a text field and make it something else. You know, wouldn't be a problem. You know, for instance, I could just, you know, inspect element just to show you how easy this is. You know, say I was trying to hack them and I wanted to put something invalid in the state field, or like some SQL injection or something. I could wait for it to pop up. All you have to do, you know, this type here, you just double click it and do text. Hit enter, and now it's just a text field. We lost all our formatting, it lost our drop down. You know, now I could do some, you know, SQL injection. You know, I could do equals and drop tables or something like that. You know, attempting to do some sort of nefarious thing. So, you know, using specific types doesn't actually prevent the user from doing bad things to your form if they want to. So, something to keep in mind. Let's see, what else do we have? Oh, this coupon code shows search. Yeah, so Firefox isn't doing anything with this search input. I think it's just Chrome that does that. Here we see two hidden inputs. So we've got, or one hidden input. So we've got like a hidden with a total item count. You know, so maybe we use JavaScript to calculate how many items, you know, the user is ordering. And we use that somewhere. You know, our server would need to know how many items to loop through or something like that. We could use this item count. But again, you can see that if you inspect element. So don't use it for anything sensitive, or at least something that you're not going to verify in another way as well. Because if we pull this up, wait for it. We have right here this input type equals hidden. Name its whole item count. All I have to do is do value equals 0. And now, you know, I'm sending the value of 0 in that field, no matter what JavaScript says. If you're smart, you know, you could have, you know, JavaScript calculate that value on form submit. But again, I could intercept that with JavaScript of my own, or something like that. I can edit your JavaScript in here if I want. So there's all kinds of things you can do. You know, so just keep that in mind. Never trust user input, because it could be bad. And again, yeah, question.
So, is there a way to recognize the source code?
There are ways. You can, you know, you can hash things together, and then validate that hash, you know, on the server side. I do that sometimes. You can, yeah, there's different ways to do it. typically the best approach though is to always check on the server side, and do your own calculations and do your own validation of your form inputs on the server
So
side.
that if they start changing up the value of the option you selected, how would you be able to see that on the server side?
Yeah, you just have to make sure it makes sense. Like, so if users have selected, products or something, and then there's a total value field, you just want to recalculate that total on the server side rather than just trusting what's in that input. So it definitely gets tricky. I mean, web security is a giant field for a reason. There's no easy ways to just kind of handle this. So yeah, and there's other, there's like cross-site request forgery, stuff like that we'll use to make sure that this form is being submitted from the website we think it is, other stuff like that you can do. But yeah, we could teach a whole class on, web security if we wanted to. So, but that's a great question, and definitely something that we have to keep in mind. So again, here we see our value. That's what shows up in the label for the button. Let's see if our pages. What the heck? I think because I'm YouTube streaming and doing the screen share, I think that I'm using a lot of internet, and so it doesn't like me. Just want to show how Chrome does it a little bit differently. Maybe. Well, we may have to come back to that. Okay. So those are some nice form features. Any other questions about forms we haven't covered? Again, there's a ton more options than this. Well, not that many more. I've covered most of the inputs, available. We can style it a lot. Forms by default are pretty ugly. You're usually going to want to do some sort of styling. I don't even really like, checkboxes and radio buttons. They're really small. If you've ever, used your mobile device and you're filling out a form and it's just default styled, those little checkboxes are really hard to hit with your finger. So I like to do some styling, make checkboxes bigger. Even use something, you don't even have to use actual checkboxes. You can use JavaScript to create your own checkboxes that then, use JavaScript to set the value of the actual checkbox. Or even just, set the value of your JSON that you're sending via AJAX. So once you get into JavaScript, you don't even have to use a form at all if you don't want to. You can kind of build your own, UI that does all the interaction for you. So if you're working on a form though, always look up, references and, kind of see what the other options are. Okay, so ID and class. So ID is really important, as is class. So any element can carry an ID attribute. So this is kind of just a generic attribute that can be on any element in your HTML. And it's used to uniquely identify that specific element. So this means that it has to be unique. So no two elements on the page can have the same ID. Technically, the browser will still probably show your page, but you might start running into problems. Some browsers will even show an error in the error console, stuff like that, if you have multiple elements with the same ID. ID attributes have to start with a letter or an underscore, so you can't start with a number or any other special character. It has to be a letter. It's kind of important to keep in mind. So your ID attribute does nothing on its own. You can set ID attributes on all of your elements and make them whatever you want. It doesn't actually affect your page at all until we start working with CSS and JavaScript. So it's how CSS and JavaScript can interact with a specific element. So say you want to style a specific element, you can target it in your CSS by that ID attribute. It's how you identify, paragraph, introduction, or whatever it is. Same with JavaScript. If you want something to happen when a user clicks on an element, or you want to move an element around or change its value, or something like that, you use the ID attribute. You can have multiple ID attributes, and you just separate them with a space inside the attribute value. So here's what it looks like. So we've got a paragraph here with ID of introduction text, and we've got a space, and we've got another ID of just ID2. So again, you can have as many IDs as you want. Technically, you only really need one, but there are some cases where you might want to add multiple. Yeah, question.
So the ID is supposed to be unique for each element.
Yes.
So is the point of the ID just to style specific elements?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So class would be if you just want. So you use a class if you want to style like multiple things.
Yes, exactly. Yep, we'll talk about class next. But yeah, ID is for targeting one specific element. Great question. Any other questions on IDs? ID and class, it'll make a lot more sense once you start using CSS. You're like, oh, now I understand why I need to put that there so that I can target that specific element. So class is very similar. Every HTML element can carry a class attribute, and it's used to identify several elements as being part of a group. So whereas ID is unique and specific, class is identifying them as a group. So for example, you might want to style some important paragraphs differently. So if you have a lot of paragraphs on your page and some of them are important, you might add class equals important to those important paragraphs. And then in your CSS, you can say, okay, all paragraphs with class of important, make the font size bigger, or whatever it is that you want to do. So again, multiple elements, even though different types, can share the same class attribute. So you can have a paragraph and you can have a heading that both have that important attribute. You got to be a little bit careful, if you say, okay, now make everything important a certain font size, keep in mind it's going to affect your headings and your paragraphs. But that's a way that you can do it. You can also specify in your CSS only headings with class important or only paragraphs with class important. So you can get really fine details with your CSS selectors. Similar to IDs, you can have multiple classes and you separate them with a space. Here we've got p class equals important and uber important. So I'm doing both of those. You can also still have an ID if you have a class as well. So you can have both. And there are certainly valid reasons to have both IDs and classes. Questions about IDs or classes so far? Good. Okay, one thing that's really important to talk about is block and inline level elements. So some elements will always appear on a new line. These are called block level elements. They also have some other properties. They can be resized. They have height and width, things like that. So examples of these are like headings, paragraphs, list items, things like that are block level elements. So every paragraph gets a new line. Every heading gets a new line. However, there are some elements that continue on the same line as the text that they're in. These are called inline elements. So links are inline, stuff like bold or emphasis or strong, those are inline. So again, if you think of a paragraph, if you've got an emphasis tag inside your paragraph, you're indicating this word or these words are emphasized. So you don't want them to break out to a new line. You want them to flow within your text. So that's why they're called inline elements, because they just kind of flow along with your text. Images are inline as well. So, if you have an image in some paragraph text, it'll just kind of flow within that text. So it's an important thing to keep in mind. We can change this property, in CSS. We'll talk about that later. But it's good to keep these in mind. Inputs also are inline. So, for instance, that's why email and password here are just next to each other. They don't get new lines because they're inline elements. Same with like this radio box here. We had two radio buttons. They don't get a new line by default. So again, this is one case where it may make sense sometimes to use a break tag. It's still not the preferred way to do this. When we get into CSS, we'll talk about other ways to do stuff like this. But say you really wanted email and password here to be on a different line. You could use a break tag to create that line break manually. Again, there's other ways to do it, but that is a valid use of a break tag. And you'll notice, name here does break to a new line, and it's simply because there's not enough room for it over here. And in fact, if we take our browser and kind of shrunk it a little bit, we'd probably see password breakdown at some point too, yeah. So even the label's inline. So here there's room for the label, but there's not room for the input, so the input drops down to a new line. So Just something to keep in mind is that your form inputs will be inline by default. So div is a really important element. So div is kind of just a generic element. So it doesn't really have any meaning associated to it. It doesn't really have any features associated to it. It's just a generic block level element. So it's block level, meaning every div gets a new line. So that's kind of useful. But yeah, otherwise divs are not styled any differently. The magic with divs comes when we add an ID or a class to them so that we can style them differently. So divs typically are how we'll group sections together, we'll group multiple elements together. So for instance, like if we go back to our form here, if we really wanted to, we could put a div around our email. Maybe we can give it a class email input or something like that. And then we close our div. And now, because that div is a block level element, password is, kicked down to a new line because that div should be on its own line. So even though password isn't wrapped in a div, having divs kind of will take up the full width by default, so it's kicking stuff down. Again, there's a little bit better ways to handle that even than wrapping everything in a div that you want, but it's a valid way to do it. If we look at if you start looking at the source code of different websites, even like Google, it's actually kind of astounding how complex their HTML is for such a simple page. But you'll notice it's divs everywhere. They use divs inordinately, just for fun almost. I don't even really understand why they have so many divs. So they've got like a div for the viewport. If you click like this little arrow here, you can like expand, and see what else they have. So, div main, div with all these crazy IDs that who knows what they mean. So they've got stuff nested in many, many layers of divs. And you can kind of see how these are broken out. I'm sure it has to do with mobile and responsive stuff, and who even knows, but they have very complex HTML for a very simple page. I'm sure with good reason, but. Okay, so that's divs. Any questions on divs? Again, you'll kind of figure out, it's really tempting a lot of times to just throw divs everywhere, kind of like Google did, wrap everything around a div, but I like to use them as sparingly as possible because you don't want just extra elements that don't really serve much of a purpose in your HTML. It makes it get confusing. It makes, like Google's, you can't really tell what's where because there's just divs everywhere. But you'll find when you're doing styling, kind of when you need to use a div to group something together so you can move it around, something like that. So you'll kind of figure it out as you go when you need to add a div and when you don't. But for instance, it's a good idea to group a section of your page with a div, especially if you're going to want to space sections out. If you've got a heading and some paragraphs and some links, and then another section with headings and paragraphs and links, like a blog post or something, you might want to add padding around that blog post to space them out. Wrap each post around a div. That way you can deal with each post individually as an element, as an item itself. Similar to div is span, which is an inline equivalent of div. So div is block level. It's used to kind of group sections or group multiple elements together. Span is just a generic inline element. So it'll contain a section of text that has no other suitable element to differentiate it from its surrounding text. So you can also group together a number of inline elements as well. So span elements can have ID and class attributes, which is usually what we use them for, to style them via CSS. So I most often use spans. Sometimes I'll use it in paragraph text if there's some text that I want to style a little bit differently, but it doesn't really make sense as strong or emphasis or something like that. Span is kind of just like a generic version of strong and emphasis that you can then style however you want. I also use spans quite a bit when I'm building UIs. So, say I'm building some UI that's, um, I don't know, it has some, you've got like, a name. Let's say it's like your profile or something. You've got like some labels, and then some text, like name, Kraig. I don't know. It's not really. It's just some scribbles. But say you've got like a UI and you've got like labels, or you've got labels on buttons or something like that. So you've got these kind of random text elements throughout your UI that are inline. They don't really make sense as strong emphasis. You can use a span to surround those so that you can style those labels specifically, or those groups of inline elements specifically. So again, span's just kind of a generic inline element you can use when there's no other element that really makes sense there, but you need to style it differently. Questions about spans? Again, you'll kind of figure out when you need to use them. So iframe is kind of important to talk about, although they're fading in relevancy. Iframes allow you to load a separate web page in a small window of an existing web page. So it allows you to sort of create a window in your page that loads another page inside that window. They're commonly used to like embed Google Maps or something like that. There's several attributes you can use with iframes. So the source is where you provide the URL for the page you're loading. This is kind of what iframes look like. I'm not going to spend much more time on it. They're not as important anymore. They used to be used a lot more commonly, but they're not important anymore. And a lot of websites now, there's security settings that will prevent your page from being loaded in an iframe. Iframes were a big source of security issues 5-10 years ago because say I had my web page kraig.com or something. I could like load Facebook in an iframe. That Facebook iframe would get all of your cookies, right? So you'd be logged into it, and I could overlay some like a button on top of a Facebook button or something like that, or I could overlay like a form input on top of the post or something, or even like a login form. That was the most common. Is like you'd create a website called like faceblue.com or something. Have it be 100% an iframe, so the whole thing is just an iframe to Facebook, and you'd use JavaScript to overlay like your own login form on top of the Facebook login form. So when the user fills out, like, okay, cool, I'll log into Facebook, not noticing they're on faceblue.com instead of Facebook. Fill out the form, click the button, but now that's your form that you've overlaid on top of the iframe. So it gets sent to your server, and now you have their Facebook password because they didn't notice and you used an iframe to load in. So most websites now will prevent you from loading their page in an iframe. If you try to do that, if you try to create an iframe with Facebook.com, it won't let you because there's security settings that are developed to prevent that. So because of that, iframes aren't used as much. Real quickly, let's finish up. So meta elements go inside your head element. So we talked about that head element at the top of your HTML. Meta tags are the other types of information that you can provide there. So they're not visible to users, but they provide some information about your page, typically to search engines as well as browsers. They're empty elements. I'll show a couple examples. So there's meta, name equals description, content equals my web page. So most of these are used by search engines. So this will provide some description of your page. So if you notice on Google, when you see your listings, there's usually a few sentences along with the result that kind of describe the page. You provide that to Google with this meta tag. So when Google's crawling your site, they'll see that meta tag and they'll save that and provide it as a description of your page. You can also provide keywords. So in theory, Google will see this and say, okay, if someone searched for websites, I'll show them this page because this page has said that a keyword is websites. Unfortunately, this was abused really badly a few years ago because you could create some sort of scam website, and if you created that faceblue.com, you could add Facebook as your keyword, and in theory someone Googled for Facebook, your site would show up because you had a keyword of Facebook. So people could really abuse that. So Google doesn't really care as much what you put here anymore. It still has some minor effect, so it's worth doing, but so if you have a website about WashU, putting WashU University St. Louis, stuff like that. Still has some effect, but Google certainly doesn't use it as a source of truth anymore. There's also a robots meta that you can tell search engines to not index the content of a page. So I use this a lot. You know, if you're building an application that users log into, you don't really want Google to index those internal logged in pages or certainly any sort of administration pages because they're private. They change all the time. It's not something that should show up in Google results. So you can use this no index to tell Google, hey, don't include this in search results. There's certainly valid reasons to do that. You can also provide like an author information. You can provide some cache information, so you can tell browsers not to cache the page locally. So like Facebook will do this. They'll say, you know, content no cache because they don't want your browser to serve up a saved version of Facebook that you've already seen. They want to always get a new version. You can also do expires to tell when to expire the cached version. There's also escape characters. These aren't super important, but you can come back and look at them if you want to use. Like if you want to use a less than sign in your HTML, you're kind of screwed because that's how you create elements, right? So there's you use this ampersand LT in place of the less than sign, and the browser renders it as the less than sign. That's really about it. The rest of these, you can skim through the rest of these slides. It kind of just shows some formatting. Oh, and there's some HTML5 elements. We'll talk about these on next Tuesday as well. So, okay, let us know if you have any questions on your assignment, and I'll see you guys next week.
Do you mind if we go to different sections?
Yeah, that should be okay.
Alright, so we could take our quiz into different sections.
Yeah, that's totally fine.
Also, are the slides for next Tuesday posted?
Not yet, but I usually post them right after the lecture.
Alright. Okay, cool. I mean, the thing is, this is Jewish holiday. I don't use my computer until after it ends. Are you able to post it before? I mean, it's
usually I don't. Usually I change it right before a little bit.
I can see it after.
I know, I love it.
Cool. Hey, what's up?
Hey, so I did the assignment. I'm not very good at this whole.
Oh yeah, you're good.
Alright, so here's my assignment. It
Uh-huh.
works well. I can pull it up on my Chrome thing. And this is
Yep.
it, right? So
Perfect.
how do I get it to go into here? It might already be in here. I just don't know what to do.
So let's see. You've got. So this is your personal history. So that's the right one.
Okay.
You saved the file, presumably.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really show up here.
So if you click history, go to the
Uh-huh.
history thing.
Have you already committed it?
Like some of the stuff is here. So,
Okay.
yeah. I'm
So,
not sure.
like, was that the most recent change you made?
Probably is like a small change.
Okay.
I have a
Yeah.
I just added a space just to
Okay.
an attribute.
Yep.
Is that
And
anything
so-
that goes?
And you've
Inside
already
the
pushed it, looks
bracket.
like, as well, I would think.
Yeah, I did.
Um,
So does that mean it's
Yeah, it means it's good to go. So now you just need to go to github.com and make sure you change that setting for the GitHub pages.
Okay, I
Um,
did because my first assignment worked.
So I'll
Okay.
go ahead and
Yeah. Check it out and let me know what you find. What's up?
So for this, are we supposed to do one of each, or just at least one? Just pick one.
Yeah, no, one of each.
Okay.
Yep, at least one of each. So you can have multiple, of some of those.
Okay. Also, it sounds like a lab participation period. What is that?
Yeah, so we'll do different. There's like 4 or 5 different
Like a
labs.
thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it'll be something we all work together in class on.
Okay.
Thank you. Yep. What's up?
So, in a panic yesterday, I was like, I was checking the assignment. I was like, oh god, it was due Tuesday. Like, so I thought it was
Yeah.
2 days ago.
Nice.
So I quickly did the assignment, but then I realized I was out of time. I noticed that there wasn't like any extra credit on it, but only
Yeah.
required.
Mhm.
Is there any extra credit on this assignment? Or is
Nope, not on this one.
Okay. So
Most
I
of them
wasn't sure if
won't,
I
but-
should unsubmit it and then do it.
Yeah, you can if you want, but no need. Did you find it?
I did, but go.
Okay. What's that?
So when I was creating my repository file,
Uh-huh.
you also have a file. So I just wonder, like, if this like keeps having file just creating to GitHub.
Yeah, that'll totally be fine. Yep, that should work.
Yeah.
Just make sure you click the URL in Canvas because that'll close the. For some
Okay,
reason,
so the account doesn't.
yeah. Nope, doesn't matter which one you use.
Yeah, and so homework too, if I use a lot of things from Wikipedia, I can just use a block code like this and put a
Yeah.
solution there.
Yeah, totally. That's a great way to do it.
Okay. Yeah. I couldn't find the HTML and CSS pages.
Okay, it's in the syllabus kind of towards the end of your resources. You don't have to use the book. It's just, if you're following along with the book, that's what chapter it's from. Yes, if you scroll down, that one right there, HTML and CSS.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem.
So here's my
Figure it out.
Git stuff. So what am I actually looking for?
Yeah, so these are your repositories down here.
Yeah.
So 02 here is this assignment.
Yeah.
So click on that repository, and you can look at the file and make sure it's complete. So then what you want to do is go to settings once you're in that repository.
Oh, you do this every time.
Yep, yeah, you do this every time. So just change this to master, click save, and then it'll give you this URL. So it might take a few minutes, but eventually if you click on that URL, you should see your page.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yep.
All right.
How's it going?
Good. For the notes assignment, I read it said like you have to use like the techniques from chapters 1 through 4.
Oh yeah.
So right if you use stuff like outside of that, you like I don't know.
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
Yeah, you can totally use extra stuff.
Okay,
Go above and beyond. That's totally fine.
And then I was wondering, what is the horizontal rule? That's one thing.
Yeah, so it basically just creates a line. So I'll show you an example.
Oh, I think I've used that.
Okay, yeah. So like, if like here in between email and password, I wanted to use an HR.
It's just like a.
Yeah, so
separator?
right there between email and password, there's that
Yeah.
big line that goes all the way across.
Okay, cool.
That's what the HR is.
Also, I've been kind of struggling. Just show you.
Yeah.
I'm doing Beyonce. So, basically, I'm like, for some reason, I just struggle with like the div stuff. Like, if
Okay.
I want to have like this, and then like I use like a div tag for that, but I also like want stuff here.
Oh yeah, sure.
How do I like,
Yeah.
use that?
So we'll talk about that more when we get into CSS, but the way to do it is with to set the width. So like you got this div right here, and you notice how it takes up the full width of the page.
Yeah.
So in our CSS, so we can just do like width, and you can do like 33% or something if you want to take a third.
Okay. Oh, so it's like, because I've seen like it's bounds like off the page. That way
Yeah.
it said it's bounds.
Yeah,
oh,
exactly.
Okay, that makes
So
sense.
now you see that that's the width.
Yeah.
So if you have another, other elements here now, you may still have to do like float
Yeah.
to cause them to be able to go up. So I would look at setting width of divs and then using float to cause them to flow together.
Gotcha.
That's
Thank
what
you so much.
Yep, no problem.
That makes a lot of sense.
How long does your battery typically last on the new MacBook?
Not too long.
Not
It
too
charges
long.
really fast.
Okay, good to know. Mine now is down
What
to
I hate
2
about
hours.
mine, my keys jam so easily.
Oh, really?
Like
That's
right
good
now,
to know.
my V key is jammed, so when I try to paste anything, it pastes twice.
Oh,
it's
wow.
so annoying.
That is annoying.
Because I won't like see it in my code. I'm like, why isn't this working? And I'm like,
Yeah.
it's there twice. Like,
Good to know.
It's rough.
How you guys doing? Good. Okay, gotcha. Okay, perfect.
But I don't have access to the second section, so I just need some.
Oh yeah. Okay. Do you not have access on campus to
No,
this?
it's just not.
Oh, okay.
Okay, sorry.
I'll tell them to make sure you guys get added.
Yeah, because like I know Bartek's not in Slack, but I just didn't know it was taking me again.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are the only three. And like Devin, I thought it was more, so I feel like there are people
Yeah, I thought it was more for some reason too, but
like more like 6 or something.
yeah. Okay. Yeah, thanks for doing that. I'll message you that. Oh, today probably. Yeah, I'll look too through and see if I set them.
I just like downloaded an Excel spreadsheet of like the names of people from past semesters.
Okay. Gotcha. I can probably send you a list in the from registration. Let me do that real fast. For the second section. Sorry, we'll get started here in just a second. Oh, it's probably sharing my screen, isn't it? Well, I'll do that after class. Let's try to print now. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'm gonna pop up a print dialog. Okay, so we're gonna pick up pretty much where we left off on Tuesday, and continue talking about different HTML elements that we have available to us. So we're gonna start talking about forms. And my computer's frozen. We need to. Yep. Oh, great. Be 1 second. We're installing updates. So. Just a plug if you're interested. I use Firefox Nightly, which is like the nightly build. So you get the new features pretty quickly. You get the new bugs pretty quickly too, so you have to watch out for that sometimes. But it's kind of nice. And there. Okay. So we're going to start by talking about forms. So forms are the way that we provide user input on our website. So anything the user needs to, type some input in, provide some data, something like that, we'll use a form for. So, like a search box or an order form, etc. There are several types of form controls we have available to us to provide different types of input. So we can have just, single line text input. We can also have like a password input or a text area. We've got different ways to provide choices. Then we've got our submission. So the forms submit the information to a web server, and then the server processes that information and saves it or something. So all we're really doing here, again, is what we call the front end, which is just sort of the input side of things. So we'll deal, when we get into JavaScript with maybe processing some of that data. But in general, what we're doing here is we're just inputting data and then we're sending it to the server and letting them deal with, processing it and doing whatever needs to be done. So we use a form element to wrap our entire form. So we start with an opening form and end with a closing form after all of our elements. There's a required attribute of action, which provides the URL that the form submits its information to. So again, the form is sending that information somewhere else. It can be on the same, website, or it could even be just the same page if whatever, page you're viewing, the server can also handle submission to that same URL. But it's required to provide some sort of action. We also have a method attribute, which can be one of two things. It can be either get or post. So get, again, we talked about as HTTP verb. It's indicating that we're just requesting some sort of information. We're requesting a resource. It can have some, information with it. Like if it's a search query, we have a query string along with our search, with some text in it. So, but it's still just a GET request. We're not expecting the server to save that query string or to process it in some way. It's just an identifier of what information we want. So again, you can have a form that uses GET that may have one or two fields on it, but those are just sort options or something like that. And then post we would use if we're actually sending data. So like an order form or a contact box or something like that, where we're sending information to the server that it should then save or relay somewhere else or something like that. We use input elements for multiple types of form control. So it's kind of a generic form input, and then we use the type attribute to determine the type of input that is. Input's an empty element. There's no contents that go within it, so it is self-closing. The name attribute is pretty important, and it gives a unique name to that input that identifies it when it's sent to the server. So when the server gets a form input, what it's getting is key value pairs of the names of the inputs and then the values of those inputs. So the name attribute is how we uniquely identify that input. So it's how we tell the server, okay, this is the first name, and then it gets the value of that input. So a couple different types of text input. So first is just generic input type equals text. It will just be a single line box. We can adjust the width of it and even the height with CSS, but it's just a one-line text box, so it's great for things like name, stuff like that. We also have an input type of password, which creates a password box. All it really does is it obfuscates the input. So when someone's sharing their screen and they're typing a password in, you can't actually see what the password is because it obfuscates it. So that's really important to use a lot of cases. Even like a credit card number or like a credit card security code will typically use password inputs. So that someone looking over your shoulder can't read your credit card information that you've typed in. It's worth noting the password input doesn't really provide any other security other than that. So you still have to do different things having to do with security to make sure that input is secure. Make sure you're hashing it on the server side and saving it and stuff like that. All it does is obfuscates the input. So there's no magic security added by just using that password input. We can also do radio buttons using input type equals radio. We use the name attribute, again, to group multiple radio buttons together. So, radio buttons usually are for some sort of list that you have choices, and you can choose one from a list. So they will all have the same name attribute for a set of choices. And then only one with the same name can be selected at a time. Then we use the value attribute to indicate the value sent to the server if that one is selected. So that's how we tell the server what the actual selected value is. There's also a checked attribute we can use to pre-select a radio button. So if there's a default option, or if you want one of them to be selected when the page loads, you can use the checked attribute. I'll show what that looks like. So here's an example of using radio input. So we've got 3 radio buttons. They all have the same name. So this is like selecting your favorite genre of music or something like that. So because they all have the same name, only one of them will be able to be selected. That's something the browser will implement. It won't let you select multiple ones. But they all have different values because they're all, unique. We'll still need some kind of label along with them as well. If we just had this HTML, you'd just see 3 radio buttons with no label. The value doesn't actually show up, visually. But again, whichever one is selected, along with the rest of your form data, you'll see genre equals pop, or whatever is selected is what the server will see. This checked, this is how you do checked. Technically, you can put whatever you want in this value. All it really matters is the attribute itself. But the best practice that is kind of settled on, what most people seem to do, is do like checked equals checked. Is just kind of the best way to do it. Some people do like checked equals yes or checked equals true or something like that. It works fine, but typically checked equals checked is the best route to go. We can also do checkboxes. So checkboxes will be used when there's like more of a multiple choice where you can select multiple options. So very similar to radio buttons in that we use the name attribute to group them together. So that's how we indicate that a set of checkboxes are all the same, option, all possible, answers to a question. However, unlike radio buttons, multiple checkboxes with the same name attribute can be selected. So you can select multiple options. And the server will get all of those options that you've selected. And different server software handles it differently. Like PHP will combine them into an array. Java will kind of handle it a little bit differently. Sometimes they just, have the multiple key value pairs in the, response object. Just kind of depends. So sometimes you have to, kind of worry about how you handle that on the server side. The value attribute, like radio buttons, indicates what actual value is sent when that checkbox is checked. So usually, sometimes you'll use a checkbox when there's just one option. Like if it's like a question to do you want to receive our newsletter? You might have a checkbox and you just have the value be yes. Because if these are selected then it's yes, they're opting in. Otherwise, if it's not checked, it won't be sent. And that's something important to keep in mind, especially once we're doing, data side stuff, server side things, is that if you have a checkbox that isn't checked, it doesn't get, the server doesn't see value opt-in equals no. They just don't see that data at all. That option is not even in the response object. So something to keep in mind. Similar to radio buttons, we have the checked attribute we can use to pre-fill default options. So here's a checkbox example. This would be like a multiple choice of what music service do you use. So they all have the same name of music service. They have different values, iTunes, Spotify, and Google Play. And then you notice I have a label here after them as well. So, I have actual text after the input with what that option indicates. Because again, the value doesn't actually show up visually, it's all behind the scenes. One thing to point out too, I didn't necessarily do a good job with that here, but typically when you're sending data to the server, especially if there's defined set of options, typically we want those values to be what we call machine readable, or we want it to be easily used in variables and stuff. So typically you want it all lowercase, you don't want to have spaces, you maybe use dashes or something like that. So for instance here, the value is just iTunes, but then in my text, my label, I can, capitalize it or whatever. Here, this is not a good example. You probably don't want to do this because it's just a little bit harder to manage on the server side. Again, you can do it. You can do whatever you want on the server side, but typically when you're dealing with server variables, you want to keep them a little bit easier for the computer to read. Okay, drop-down list. So you can use select to create a drop-down. And then you use option elements inside of the select to provide the options that they can choose from. Instead of checked, you do selected equals selected to identify the default option if you want one of them to be pre-selected. I think typically if you don't do selected equals selected, the first option that will be selected says like choose one or something like that. Different browsers will handle a little bit differently though. You can also allow multiple selections. You do multiple equals multiple. It changes it from a drop-down to more of like a select list where you can like hold command or control and select multiple options. So I don't really like doing that because I think it's confusing. Typically you'd use checkboxes if there's like a multiple choice type thing. But there are a few times when that's a good option to do. So here's an example of doing a drop-down. So we've got our select, the name goes on the select, so that's important. And then the value goes on the options. And in this case, we've said multiple, so they can select multiple ones. I'll show you what that looks like here in a little bit. But so we've got our select and multiple options. They each have different values. Whichever value is selected is what will get sent to the server. Questions so far? Yeah.
In the input mechanisms that you told us, does the user need to come up with at least one input, or like what happens if it's like an optional question?
Yeah. So typically, if it's an optional question, then the user just doesn't have to select anything, and it will just not send that to the server. So that's a valid way of doing it.
The user has to provide at least one. How do we do that?
Yeah, so there's a required attribute. I'll show you that here in a little bit. We'll talk about that, a bit here in a little bit. Really good question though, but we'll get there. So another option is to do a file input. If you want the user to be able to upload a file, if they're setting their profile image or adding an email attachment or something. So input type equals file. The behavior is a little bit different in each browser. Most of them will have like a little box with the file name and then like a browse button, and then you can choose. It'll open a dialog and you can choose the file. Sometimes you can like drag the file straight to that input and it'll select it there. Important thing to note too though is that the server has to be configured to accept that file input along with your post request. So you can't just start sending files just to any request. It has to be configured to accept that file input. It's a little bit trickier because especially if there's servers like Apache, which is a server software, will have like maximum file upload settings. So like you could say nothing bigger than 10 megabytes can be uploaded to the server, things like that. So you have to start considering these types of things. Maybe you want to restrict the file type, stuff like that. So if you're using input file, you need to make sure you're working with your server side to make sure everything's configured correctly. So then it comes the submit button. So we use input type equals submit to submit the form. The name attribute is optional. You can use the name attribute if you're going to have multiple submit buttons. So sometimes you might have like a save and then like a save and new or something like that, where there are multiple submit buttons that you want to do mostly the same thing, but maybe the server behaves a little bit differently depending on which one the user's clicked. So you can use the name attribute to do that because the server does see the name of the submit button that was clicked. The value attribute provides the actual text that is displayed on the submit button. So by default, I think it usually just says submit if you don't provide a name or a value attribute. But you can do, like here, value equals send message, and then the button will say send message. I don't like that. It's different than the rest of form inputs where the value is a machine, kind of a behind-the-scenes thing that the user doesn't see. In this case, it is something the user sees, so I don't like the way that they've handled that, but that's the way it works. Another option is to use an image for your button. So if you want to do something fancy, if you want, button. You can style buttons with CSS, and you can even do quite a bit of styling. But say you've got an image that you want to use. Instead, you can use input type equals image to replace the submit button with a custom image. It uses the same attributes that the image tag does, so source. And then you also do need to provide an alt tag or an alt attribute with your image input. Because again, screen readers, they'll just see this image, but they can't read the image if there's text on it. So you provide an alt attribute and say what that button does, what that image does. Another option is to use hidden input. So you can use input type equals hidden, which will create form controls that are not shown on the page. So there's various reasons that you might use this. Typically, you're having to do with JavaScript. So maybe there's a timestamp of when the form is submitted that you want to be sent to the server. Maybe there's some sort of calculated field, like a subtotal or a total. If it's like an order form, you might use JavaScript to calculate the total amount of the order and submit that to the server as well. User ID, something like that. A really important thing to keep in mind, though, is that that input can be seen when you do view source, so you shouldn't put anything sensitive in there. Even like security tokens and stuff, you have to be careful about, because the user can actually see what those hidden inputs are. They won't show up on your page, but if you view source or do inspect and look at the inspector, you will see those. You can also change the value of them, just in your browser. I'll show you an example of that here in a little bit. So you have to be kind of careful. For example, if you did a subtotal, it's a real thing that's happened where, a website will do that. They'll, calculate the total amount of the order in the browser. They'll put a hidden input field where they, add that the JavaScript writes the total to that input. And then the form submits, the server gets a list of items, and it gets the total, the total amount, and it uses that field to then charge the credit card. Well, in your browser, you can edit the value of these fields. So maybe you add your products, and then you go in and you change the value of that hidden total field to $0. If the server trusts that input and just takes it as word, okay, $0, it'll charge you $0. So that's actually happened. There's all kinds of websites that have run into problems with that. So you have to be very careful. The general rule of thumb, in web security is to not trust user input. Assume that your user input is bad and trying to rip you off somehow or trying to cause problems. So, for instance, there are valid reasons to include a total as a hidden field, and maybe you use that somehow on the server to trigger different things, but you want to calculate it on the server as well before you actually charge them. So don't just trust any of these hidden inputs as definite truth, because they can be altered. So, for instance, I'll use hidden inputs a lot, to provide a user ID in like an interface. So if there's an interface and the user's doing things, I'll have a hidden input that provides the user ID so that on the server side I know, okay, this is the user that's making the change. But I still do some validation to make sure. I'll check it with the cookie or the session. I'll use it as a convenience on the server side, but you still validate it. You still make sure, because you could change the user ID and try and alter someone else's information. So you have to be really careful how you use those. So form labels. So the labels are used to create a label for the form control, and we use a label element for that. And it's really important to do this, actually. You could just have text, or you could use like a paragraph or whatever and kind of position it next to the element, and it will work. Visually, you'll see, okay, this says name, and then here's a box to type my name. That makes sense. But using the label element really helps screen readers out. And especially, there's two ways that we associate the label element with the input that it's related to. So it's really important to do that, because the screen reader will read through the form, and it needs to know what the label of that form input is. There's also a few other ways that this comes into play. Sometimes if you click on the label, some browsers will do this. If you click on the label, it will put your cursor inside the input for you, so it's a little bit easier to deal with. So there's two ways to associate the label with the input. The first is to put the input inside the label element. So it's a perfectly valid way to do it. So we've got our label, we've got our actual label text, first name, and then we have our input. and then we close our label. So the input is contained inside of the label. So that's one valid way to do it. Another way that I think is preferable in most situations is to use a for attribute. So you use the for attribute, and it corresponds to an ID attribute that you put on the input. We'll talk more about IDs towards the end of the lecture, but we've got our label, and we do for equals first name, and then that corresponds with this ID input of first name that we put on the input. So the reason I like this better is if you do it this way, you're a little bit restricted in the positioning that you can do because your input is a sub-element of the label. So if you move the label somewhere, if you say, okay, I want to move my label 20 pixels to the left, the input's going to move as well because it's contained within that element. So doing it this way kind of decouples them a little bit so you can move them independently a little bit easier. So I prefer to do it this way. Sometimes you might even have all of your labels and then all of your inputs. There's valid reasons to do that. But if you use this method, it doesn't really matter where they're located in your HTML. The screen reader knows, okay, when I hit this input, here's how I find the label. And the screen reader will read it in a way that makes sense. It's also important to point out that your label location should be pretty obvious which input it goes along with. I've seen websites that, for instance, a really bad choice is to put the label below the input. I've seen that before where you have like an input and then the label or something. But the problem is, especially if you don't have a well-designed website, at some point with a long form, you can't tell anymore. Like, okay, well, does this label go with this input or this input? Who knows? So some options are, typically I like to do the label on top is kind of the best practice, and then the input. But then you want to space out your inputs a little bit so that it's really obvious which label goes with which input. You don't want them to be all squished together. Here you have some separation. You see, okay, cool, I know which one goes with which. You can also put it to the left if you want. That's a fine pattern to do as well. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those options when we get into design principles. But you don't just, when you're designing your form, make sure you think about how the user is going to associate with them. You don't want it to be confusing. You want to prevent your users making a mistake because that's really annoying when you fill out a form and you miss something up at some point. Okay, there's some ways to group form elements together. So if you have a long form that has multiple parts, so for instance, like a university application or something like that, you're going to have like a personal info, you're going to have like a school history, you're going to have grades, you're going to have, volunteer experience, whatever. These multiple sections that each can have multiple inputs within them. So we use field set to group multiple form controls together. And then we use legend immediately after the opening field set to give the field set a caption, so to add a title to our field set. So here's kind of what it looks like. So we have our field set, then we can have our legend, it says like contact me, and then we can have all of our inputs. Those inputs still have labels. And all of this goes inside of our form element. I'll show you an example of what it looks like here in a little bit. There's some newer form features with HTML5 that the browsers have added that make things a little bit more convenient. So first is a required attribute. So this is going to the question you brought up a little bit. We can now say required equals required on any input, and the browser will force the user to fill it out. So usually it will, if they skip it, it'll turn red or something. And if they try and submit the form and that value is not filled out, it will stop them from submitting the form and usually do a pop-up or something and say, oh, you can't do that, you need to fill out this field. So that's super, super useful. One thing to keep in mind, though, again, going back to web security and not trusting user input, the user can remove this attribute if they want. They can go in the inspector and they can just remove that attribute from the HTML, and now they can submit the form without that value. So you still want to validate it on the server side. If you know that, if you don't have, if you're creating a user object and you know that there's no email that's going to throw an error, make sure you check on your server side that all of the inputs inputs that you really need exist, and if not, return an error message to the user. So again, these are really convenient. They solve like 95% of the problems that users have with forms because it prevents them from making a mistake. But for security reasons, you still have to make sure you validate, on the server side. A couple other examples of some of the things. We have a date input now. So input type equals date. This was hugely helpful because it used to be you just had to use a text box and maybe tell the user what format to put the date in. There's all kinds of different date formats you can use. Different, some countries put the month before the day or the day before the month. So you never quite know what that is. You don't know if they're using slashes or dashes. So it used to be a huge pain to deal with dates on forms, but now there's this date input, so the browsers will do a pop-up that kind of shows a calendar, and they can select the date in that pop-up, and it'll pre-fill the field then. Older browsers will just use the text box. So if a browser doesn't support this date type, then it'll just show us a text box. It's kind of nice, actually, that the older HTML specs, basically, if whatever's in the type is just not valid, it just uses the text box. So it's kind of a nice feature of older browsers. So now, they've added these new features using these different types, and older browsers just ignore it and just show a text box. So it doesn't break anything to use these. It's just less convenient. We also have an email input type now, so it will verify a proper email address has been inputted. So if the user doesn't use an @ symbol and have a .com or whatever, it will reject their input. We also have a URL type, which will specify that it's URL. There's also a number input type as well now, or at least phone, I think, is one of them now as well. And one really nice feature about these as well is that if you're on a mobile device, and you may have seen this, sometimes when you go to the input, it'll change the keyboard based on what the input type is. So if your mobile browser knows it's a number input, it'll show you a number dial pad instead of the full keyboard, which is kind of nice. Same with like email, it'll usually now it'll show like the @ sign and like .com and .net or whatever kind of on your keyboard, so it makes it a little bit easier to put in your email. Also helps you with pre-fill, so if you use input type of email, your browser knows, hey, this is an email address, I probably know what their email address is, and it'll give you those pre-fill options. So again, really nice to do that. There's also a search input type that I don't really understand very much what it's for. Usually it has a clear button next to it, so if you type something in, it has a little X you can click and it clears out your input. But only some browsers do that. Firefox, for instance, doesn't really do anything with the search input. So you might use it if you've got a search box, and especially if you're doing some JavaScript to load the results or something, it might be kind of handy, but it's not that useful. There's also a placeholder attribute now, which can be used to add background text in any text field. So, we talked about text area. I think we've talked about text area. Any contents inside the text area are pre-filled, and the user has to delete them. Placeholder is better because it shows it just in the background. Once the user clicks into the field, the placeholder disappears. So they don't have to select it and delete it. It's not going to be accidentally submitted. It's just kind of a background text. So that's really nice. I'll show an example of that here in a minute. I'll show an example now. Hold this up. Turn the battery off. Get out of the way here for a minute. So here's an example of a form. So minimize this. So we've got our form element. That's the most important part, or the first part of our form. So it's got an action here. Just check out that PHP. So again, this action can be relative or absolute. In this case, it's just a different URL on the same web page. So if I'm on washu.edu, that would be washu.edu/checkout.php. And typically, your action is going to be some sort of server-side URL, something that's going to be handled by a programming language of some sort. It's usually not going to be an HTML page, right? because the HTML page can't do anything with that input. It has to be some sort of server-side thing that's going to handle it. Unless you're using like React along with like React Router or something, and you're using JavaScript to handle that routing. That would be the only exception there. So then here's an example of what a field set looks like. So inside our form, we've got a field set element. It goes all the way down to here where we close it, and then we've got our legend is the first element inside the field set that provides a label. So here you can see the field set, it just draws a box around all those inputs, and it kind of puts the label up here. It's kind of, I don't know, I think it's interesting how they chose to style that by default. But you can change it. You can move the label around. You can remove that border if you want. It's still a nice way to, break out the structure of your form. So here's an example of a select box with multiple. So this is an example where I don't like to use this multiple select because, again, a lot of users don't understand that if you just hold Control or Command on a Mac, you can select multiple ones or even Shift if you want to like select all of them. A lot of people, it's a little bit harder for users to use, so I don't really like this option, but this is what it looks like. And if it's long enough, in here it'll scroll with those options. But if we remove multiple, then it'll turn into just a normal drop-down. So now it's just a regular drop-down, where the user can only select one. They can no longer select multiple. They can only pick one option. So really, this is an example, this is where they're choosing, the products they want to buy. This is kind of a better option for some checkboxes. So we will switch it to checkboxes, and we'll do input type equals checkbox, and then the value is going to be the same because the value here is kind of the group, or not the value, the name is going to be the same. So we'll call it like product, and then the value is unique to that checkbox. So the value is what that checkbox actually is indicating. In this case, it's shoes. So then, and then we'll also close. We'll get rid of this closing input. Technically, the browsers can handle if you put a closing input tag, but it's not really valid. I'm just gonna paste this. Paste the whole thing. Then we'll get rid of computer's running so slow. I think it's because I'm doing the YouTube streaming thing. Well, it appears to be frozen. But this is how it's not even going to show us. This is how we would do, multiple checkboxes. They all have the same name. Really, we need to change the value. This is shirt, the value of this is pants, etc. Yeah, we're not looking good. We might need to figure out a better option here. Oh, we're installing more updates. So plug in power. Great. Thank you, Firefox. Yes, we want to restore session. Okay. Probably gonna lost those changes we made, but that's okay. You get the idea of checkboxes. And we're gonna need to. I also changed. I realized it was YouTube streaming in like 360p or something like that, and that wasn't great. So I upped it to 1080p, and that might be why it's slowing everything down. Okay, so here's a text area. Again, it has a name value. Let's see. You know, anything inside of the text area shows up actual text in the text area. You know, so the user, you know, if they just like start typing, they have to actually delete what's already in there. So as an alternative, and kind of what I prefer to do now that we have placeholder, would be to delete that text and add a placeholder attribute. And then let's update. We'll see it looks a little bit different, like it's kind of muted, so it's a little bit darker. It's in the background, and once we actually click into it, the placeholder, or once we start typing, the placeholder text will disappear. So it's a really nice way to provide a label, really nice way to kind of indicate what format you want the information to be formatted in, because it's not really a hassle for the user to get rid of it. Here's the email. So, you know, if we just type something random in here, usually once you tab away from it, different browsers handle this differently. Firefox does a good job. It'll highlight it red before you even submit the form. I think Chrome waits until you submit the form to tell you about it. I can't remember. So the browsers kind of handle that a little bit differently. Yeah, question.
If you delete what you wrote in the special request form,
Mm-hmm.
does the placeholder appear again?
Yep, it does. Yep, anytime it's empty, the placeholder appears. But again, it's not text, you know, in the input. So if it's not a required input and I submit it, that text doesn't get submitted in that input. It's just visual. Good question. So, you know, Firefox won't like this until I, you know, make this, you know, an actual email address that's valid. You know, even if I leave out the @ symbol, it's still not going to like it. It has to be an actual email address. Password input, you know, you can't see what it looks like. Here's a, you know, checkbox example. But here's some examples of the labels too. You know, so here I've got the input inside the label, which again is a fine way to do it. The alternative, if we wanted to, you know, close the label here and get rid of that. You know, if we just have it like this, where there's a label and then there's an input, there's no actual correlation here between the two, other than that they're next to each other, but that's not really good enough. We need to really specify what it's for. So we use the for attribute, and we can say email. And then again, we have to provide the ID to make that connection. The name, even though it's email, isn't what's used to make that correlation. We have to use ID equals email, and now the browser knows, and screen readers will know that that label goes with that input. I think, yeah, so if you actually click here on just the label of email, it will actually put your cursor inside there for you, which is kind of nice. Like if we took out this label and we just made it password, again, you'll notice visually it's the exact same. So we no longer have a label, you know, around the password. We just have the text password. It doesn't change anything visually, right? Like nothing is different visually. word password is still there. But now when we click on password, it doesn't, put our cursor in the label. It tries to, select that text or something. Whereas here on email, if we click on email, like I just clicked on the word email and it put my cursor into the box. So again, kind of a nice feature. It's nice for like mobile devices because it will also do the same thing with the checkboxes or the radio button. So you notice here I'm not actually clicking the radio button. I'm just clicking the label and it selects that radio button. So if you ever used a form on your mobile device that's not optimized for mobile, those little checkboxes can be really tiny and the radio buttons are kind of hard to hit exactly. So this lets you click the label as well. So kind of a nice feature. One thing to keep in mind, like say I, put in something random here in email, if I click submit even, Firefox prevents form submission, so it doesn't submit the form, and then it'll pop up and say, please enter an email address, and it'll also highlight the other required fields that I haven't put in. But show you a little bit of how to hack a website. Not really, but kind of the first step, honestly. Like if I was trying to hack this website and get a form input submitted that isn't allowed, the very first thing I would do would be to inspect it, pull it up in the inspector, and see, okay, this is type email. I'm going to change this to type text, and now I don't have to put an email address in there. It can just be some sort of random text. I could even see this, okay, input name is required. I'm going to take out the required element, or the required attribute. It's no longer a required element. So I can, tab out of it for empty. I can submit the form now. It's no longer required. Same goes, there's an input, hidden input in here as well. So I have this, type hidden name as total item count. So say I selected some items, but I wanted this to show up as 0 for some reason. I could do value equals 0, or it needs to be in quotes, even if it's like a number. So you can edit the form entirely in your browser. It's not hard to do. It's one of the nice things, honestly, from since the inspector is popular, it's brought up a lot of these security issues. Like, hey, it's really easy to change your HTML, so we need to make sure that we're handling the form submission on the server side in a secure way and make sure we're validating everything. Because using these required attributes is really handy. Again, for 99% of users, it's a benefit. They're going to not be able to accidentally submit an incorrect form. But from a security perspective, just adding required to our form doesn't, fully fix any security issues. We still have to handle things appropriately on the back end. Okay, so that's about it for this form. Again, submit order here is the value of my input. So whatever this value is, it could be go. And now the button says go. So whatever the value of that input is what you'll see. Okay, any questions about forms before we move on? Okay, got a few minutes here. We'll get as far as the first class did. I think we're going a little quicker this time. So let's talk about IDs and classes. So any element can carry an ID attribute, which is used to uniquely identify a specific element on the page. So again, it uniquely identifies that specific element. So IDs should be unique for each element. You shouldn't have multiple elements with the same ID. Technically, it's not going to break your page, but it may cause problems with your CSS or with your JavaScript, and it's not going to be valid HTML at that point if you have multiple elements with the same ID. IDs have to start with a letter or an underscore, so they can't start with a number or a space or a special character of some sort. It's just the rules of HTML. So yeah, the ID and attribute the ID attribute is used by CSS and JavaScript to interact with that specific element. You can also have multiple ID attributes or multiple ID attribute values. You separate them with a space. So you can say, like, we've got a paragraph. We say ID equals introduction text, and then space and ID2. So now both of those IDs are uniquely identifying that paragraph. Technically, you rarely need more than one ID because, again, it should be unique, but there are a few cases where it makes sense to have multiple IDs. So again, IDs don't do anything by themselves. You could add all kinds of ID attributes to all of your elements on your page. It doesn't really do anything by default. It's just a way of being able to identify that element when we get into CSS and JavaScript. So it really becomes very powerful and even necessary once we get into styling and dealing with interaction. So when we're dealing with React, we're going to deal with a lot of IDs because it's how React knows how to identify the elements on your page. The class attribute is very, very similar, except that it's used to identify several elements as being part of a group. So if you put class attributes, it's not uniquely identifying elements, but it's identifying a group of elements. So for example, you might want to style some important paragraphs differently. Maybe you want important paragraphs to be bold or something. You can give it a class of important. So P class equals important. And you can put that on as many paragraphs as you want. And then you can say in your CSS, okay, any paragraph with class important, make it bold. And it'll make those paragraphs bold. You can even have multiple elements of different types that can all share the same class. So you can have important headings and important paragraphs. And you can target them differently in your CSS if you want. So, when we get into CSS, we'll talk about how that works. And similar to IDs, you can have multiple values for your class attribute, and you just separate them with a space. And note here, you can even have classes and IDs as well. You may need an element to be a part of a group and also to be uniquely identifiable. So it's perfectly valid to have classes as well as IDs. Okay, so block and inline elements. So some elements always appear on a new line. You've probably noticed this. Paragraphs always appear on a new line. Those are block level elements because they always get a new line. Headings, if you have two headings, they'll be on separate lines. Lists and list items, those are all block level elements. Some elements, however, continue on the same line. They continue in the flow of the text. So these are inline elements. They just appear in line. They don't get a new line. So things like links, bold or emphasis, images, and inputs are all inline. So again, if you've got a paragraph of text and you want a couple words to be emphasized, you put the emphasis. You don't want them to get a new line, so they're inline elements. Inputs also, so for example, if we look at our form here, like these inputs, because they're inline, as well as this text, that's why they, these are all next to each other. These just kind of span. The only reason name is here on a new line is because there's not room for it up here. So this is one example of where, it sometimes makes sense to use a break tag. I'd added one there for the previous class. But, say we want a space here between email and password. So we've got our email. We could do a break tag here, which would break password down onto a new line. So there's other ways to do that. You can make inline elements act like block level elements. I typically do that. I'll set my inputs to block level elements, and it changes the way it works. But by default, they're inline. So you might have to use break tags to get them down to a new line if that's what you want. Okay. Divs are also really important to talk about. So divs are just a generic block level element. So divs don't have any sort of semantic meaning to them. They don't have any kind of features built in. The browser doesn't treat them, doesn't do anything special. It's just a generic block level element. I think it stands for division or something like that. So it's block level, so every div will get a new line. divs also by default take up the full width of the page, so you'll notice if you have divs, nothing else can be to the left or the right unless you change the way it works. They're not styled any differently otherwise. They're just kind of generic. The power with divs comes when you give it ID or class attributes that then we style with our CSS or do something with JavaScript. So divs are how we would do like a column layout. We can have all of that content in a div, give that whole div a width of 33% or something if we want 3 columns. We use float to make them float next to each other, things like that. So divs are kind of how we group groupings of elements together. So it's usually a good idea to group sections of your page with divs. It's kind of a good way to, structurally separate different sections of your page. Really common, if you look, like if we look at, this is a different, if we look at like google.com, you'll see they have lots of divs. Pretty simple page, right? There's not that much going on here. But if you look at their HTML, because they're Google, it's very complex and mostly with lots and lots of divs.